So I said, oh, how much lab experience do you have? And then we ended up getting him early, and it's been a fantastic success. I'm really excited about the project he's working on, and I think you all will be too after you hear the presentation. And if we're lucky enough, we might be able to see some of his product in development. Please all welcome Sushant to the stage.
No.
Alright, so I'm Sushant, I'm a 19-year-old university student, and I'm working on this thing that I've named ineon film. Basically, it's plastic made from the shells of prawns, lobsters, and crabs. Alright, so in 2050, I'm sure you've read this statistic a lot. In 2050, we're going to have 9 billion people. Can you hear me? Yes. We have 9 billion people on the planet in 2050. And the question everyone's asking is always, how do we feed those 9 billion people? Little did you know, or maybe you did know if you were so unworded, if you cared about that stuff. But today we actually produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. That's today in 2016. We produce enough food to feed everyone as well as 2 billion extra people. Now, despite that, there's still 1 billion people suffering from starvation on the planet. And the thing that everyone's asking is why is that? People always suggest one of 4 things to address this issue, like economists, industry leaders, and journalists and whatnot. So the first one is obviously grow more. Like if you have to feed 2 billion more people than there are on the planet now, you grow more. That's just common sense. Like, yeah, makes sense. The only problem with this is all the land that is developed by human beings, 40% of it goes to agriculture and livestock. It's 40% of all the land on Earth goes to that. Only maybe around 10% goes to actually living. That's where the 7 billion people live. So that's not really an option because we're already, unless we're going to cut down more rainforests and whatnot, that's not really an option. So another option that's heralded by this guy called Desmond Despomier, and he's from New York University, or the University of New York, and that's vertical farms, and basically just all farms horizontal right now, and he's suggesting, hey, why don't we go upwards instead of outward? And the problem with this is it uses a lot of energy, and it costs a lot more compared to just regular traditional horizontal farms. So that's not really an option. And there are 2 other things that they suggest, and that's either shift diets or reduce wastage. Shift diets, the reason they say this is because the richer people get, if you're in a developing country, the more likely it is you're going to eat meat. And livestock, out of the crops that we produce, 55% is eaten by humans. 40% goes to livestock, and the remaining goes to industrial products and biofuels and whatnot. So that's literally 40% is going to creating beef, chicken, pork, etc. Not only that, it's actually extremely inefficient. So if you want to get, if you put in 100 calories worth of grain, you get 3 calories worth of beef out. If you put 100 calories worth of grain, you get 12 calories worth of chicken out. So that yield is literally nothing when you're trying to get meat. And if we're going to increase population by 35%, the majority of which is going to happen in developing countries, they're getting richer, they're all eating meat, we'll have to double crop production we'll have to double crop production to only feed 35% extra people, which doesn't make sense, it's counterintuitive, but that's just how much livestock uses and that we're not eating. So if we were to shift diets away from meat and more people vegetarian and whatnot, then that's a lot less food we have to produce. This last one is reduce wastage. And I'm sure you've heard people like the US waste enough food to feed their country 3 times over, and just food that people are buying and throwing away after not eating it. The problem with these 2 is that they're cultural. You can't implement anything to have the effects that you want. It'll take a long time, and if any of you are familiar with lab-grown meat and whatnot, there's a lot of resistance to eating meat grown in a fermenter or in beer keg or something. But despite it being meat, people just don't want to let go of the fact that it's not coming from an animal and they don't want to eat it. And that's prevailing in a lot of, like all the studies, like there was one company that did surveys on the streets of New York and they're like, hey, the lab-grown meat actually tastes better than the natural meat, but we don't want to buy that meat because doesn't come from an animal. And we're seeing that right now. These two last ones, it's not something you can just say, okay, do that and it's going to happen, because this is people, this is culture, this is society. You can't make people do things. So none of these four options really address the fact that we cannot feed 9 billion people in 2050. The one thing they do oversee that literally no media talks about is microbial spoilage, and that is bacteria damage onto food by the bacteria or mold. And the reason it's such a big deal is that in developed countries, before the food even gets on your plate or even to the supermarket, 25% of your fruit and vegetables are lost to bacteria, fungal growth, or just over-ripening. And that's a lot of food. You go to places like West Africa or South Asia, that number is as high as 50%. If you're in Nigeria, for example, and you're trying to buy an apple, you're paying for 2 apples. The one you're getting and the one that you lost during the production process. That's a huge problem. Like literally half the amount of fruit and vegetables they're making in developing countries is being lost before customers can even buy it. And that's something that the media and whatnot never really talk about. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because as a person, like you and I, we have no impact on this. Like there's nothing we can do to make farmers or retailers like Woolworths and Coles and Aldi and whatnot to improve their processes and bring that number down. There's nothing we can do. We can just say, oh, that's pretty proud, but there's nothing really we can do. For example, and on the flip side, you always hear about wastage, that people are wasting food and whatnot. But if you look at, this is from the United Nations, the amount of food lost by the person buying it, so after they've bought it and they're throwing it away because they haven't eaten it and whatnot, it's way less than what's actually lost before it even gets to the shelf. Just between post-harvest storage, packaging, distribution, transportation, they're losing a lot of food to bacteria, mold, and just ripening, just over-ripening to the point that it's decomposing. For some numbers, you go to Europe, that's 40 million tons before it even gets to the shelf, it's lost. Fruit and vegetables only, not meat, not fish, not eggs, nothing like that, just fruit and vegetables. 40 million tons are lost to microbial spoilage and over-ripening. You go to North America, that's 35 million tons. You go to Latin America, that's around 90 million tons. You go to Africa, that's 95 million tons. These Latin America and Africa are the majority of starving people are, or what you would think about, or what you rather you would hear about. And there is so much food that can't get to them because it just lost because of crappy storage, because refrigeration costs a lot, because it uses a lot of energy. And storage is not good because bacteria just messes up, it over-ripens, and they don't know what to do because the farmers aren't educated on what to do in these situations. Because in West Africa alone, there are around 700,000 farmers. And they're not big, huge entities answering to some conglomerate like Woolworths or Coles. They're just selling in their villages or in their small towns and whatnot. They don't know what to do. They've been taught how to grow food, but they haven't taught anything past that. It's not their fault. And the biggest one, where around 3.5 billion people reside in Asia, 325 million tons. That's an insane amount of food that's being wasted before it even gets to the shelf. That's what I really want to portray, is that this is not food wasted by consumers after they've bought it. That's something we can't really have in hand. That's something that's got to do with culture that they make a choice to do. This is something that can be avoided, but hasn't been, because it's been a part of the agriculture industry since agriculture was a thing, is that from where you grow it to when you eat it, you're going to lose some food. That's just the way of life, and that's just how it's always been. That's how it always will be. Something more contextual for us. Last year, in 2014, 1 million tons of fresh fruit and vegetables was lost to microbial spoilage and over-ripening. That's a lot of food for only 24 million people. Then there's a problem of just over-ripening in general, which is it's ripening and then it gets to the point where it decomposes and you just straight up can't eat it anymore. I'll explain how ripening happens real quick so you get some context. So basically, fruit and vegetables produce this thing called ethylene gas, and when they ripen, they produce it. The thing about ethylene gas is that if the fruit or vegetable is in an environment where there's high ethylene gas, it further promotes further ripening. So it's like an exponential rate of ripening, because the more ethylene gas there is around it, the more it ripens, and thus more it produces, and so on. So before, when it's not ripe, it's acidic, it's starchy, so it doesn't really taste really good. Chlorophyll, so it's green, as you probably know, like apples or any kind of fruit, it's just fully green. And pectin, which basically gives the fruit structure, so it's really tough and hard. Whereas as it ripens, it becomes quickly neutral and starch turns to sugar, so it becomes sweet. Chlorophyll becomes anthocyanin, so it becomes it gets its colors like red, blue, whatever. And pectin becomes less and less pectin because it becomes juicier and it becomes less solid, as well as becoming aromatic and it has a nice smell. So the way retailers and whatnot they try to address this problem is, I'm sure you've bought fruit and vegetables and they have holes in the packaging. The reason they do this is so ethylene gas can escape and it doesn't accumulate around the fruit and vegetables, which further increases the rate of ripening. Now there's a trade-off when they do this, is that it's insanely, exponentially more open to bacteria, to mold, to not only that, but just insects in general, like bugs and whatnot, they can fit through those holes. It's not, if they want to slow down ripening, they have to give up protection from these things. So it's a trade-off. You have to choose one or the other. You can't have both. But what if I told you you could make something, or you could have packaging which had no trade-off? Yeah. So not only does it slow down ripening, but it kills bacteria. It completely destroys bacteria, and it dramatically reduces the rate of fungal growth. Not only that, but it reduces the rate. Wait, I've already said ripening. Yeah. Okay. So not only slows down ripening, but it kills bacteria and it reduces the growth of fungus dramatically. Okay, so there is such a thing, and basically you get prawn shells or any kind of crustacean like crabs or lobsters, which is a waste product. This would otherwise be incinerated or thrown into landfill because there is no use for them. And after a really short process, you turn it into plastic. And this is just, I like give it, and then you can like pass it around. Yeah, so that's plastic made from shells of prawns and nothing else, and water. But besides that, that's all it is. There's no polyethylene, there's nothing like that. It's just prawn shells. And I've been working on this for like 6 or 7 months now. And like, this is what it was the first time I ever made plastic. It's like really crappy and it's full of air bubbles and whatnot. And it's just like brittle and just garbage. And this was 7 months ago. And that plastic was this morning or yesterday. It smells like vinegar because I used acetic acid in the process of making it, so it gives off a vinegary smell. But that smell can get rid of really easily if you put it in a bath, which basically neutralizes the smell and it smells like nothing. I just chose not to because I only made it this morning. But yeah. I'm still working out the kinks in the entire production process because it's like a new thing, so I need to like figure out how it works and whatnot. I don't know the exact mechanical properties. Like I don't even think it's a polymer. I think it's a solution with the prawn shells like suspended in it. So I'm not even sure about that, but it's come a long way basically. So what I did was got prawn shells which are dried, and you can buy them, and you crush them up into powder, and you get that. Oops. Okay. And then you dissolve it in solution, and you cast it, and then you get plastic, which is actually more complicated than you would think, because the small piece that I sent around is like a process I made at my parents' house, like in the kitchen oven and whatnot, and it's like really crappy and it doesn't work that well. Whereas the other one, the bigger piece, that is like a lot better, and I figured out a lot of extra things that I didn't know about before. Okay, so results. So ripening of fruit. Okay, so this is a really simple experiment I did. I got a plastic cup and I filled them with cherry tomatoes or oranges, or both rather. And then I covered one with regular polyethylene that you would buy your fruit in now, and then my film, which is the knife film. And after 10 days, the fruit covered by the polyethylene was spoiled. Like you couldn't eat it, but you could, be bad. But after 10 days, the one under my film is perfectly fine. That you can eat it and it's whatever. It only started showing signs of spoilage after around 15, 16 days. That's around a 50% increase, or rather 50%. It's 50% better than LDPE when it comes to ripening, when it comes to slowing down the rate of ripening. Because it lets the ethylene gas escape, whereas low-density polyethylene doesn't. It lets the gas accumulate and accumulate, which increases the rate of ripening exponentially. Fungal growth. Okay, so I got pieces of bread. I put it in a 24. I got pieces of bread. I covered it with my plastic, and I covered it with low density polyethylene, the same type you would use to cover if you bought bread from Abbott's Bakery and whatnot. The bread will be covered in low density polyethylene. That's what that plastic is called. After 3 days, it started showing signs of mold growth, whereas it took my film 9 days. So that's 300% increase in, I don't know how to phrase like a reduction in something. Like a 300%, it's better than LDP by 300% when it comes to reducing the growth of fungus.
You increase the half. You increase the half.
Conservation.
Well, that's fungal growth. So bread is more susceptible to fungus than it is bacteria, so that is a good thing. Then it comes to bacteria. I had this in like tables with text and whatnot, but like not everyone would understand. This graph isn't statistically sound, but like it works. So on the very left is initially, so I put a known amount of bacteria into a petri dish, and they all started there. And then after 1 hour, there were 4 types of bacteria, by the way. After 1 hour, it was almost an exponential decrease because it killed almost the majority of the bacteria in the petri dish. But after 24 hours, there was no bacteria in any of the petri dishes. About any of the bacteria, all of them were killed within 24 hours of contact with my plastic.
What kills it?
I actually have no idea. Like, I think, I don't know.
Oh no.
Like, because in nature, right, it's like prawns and crabs and whatnot. They can't have their shells being eaten by bacteria, so it's just something inherent in their shells. But I don't know for sure what it is exactly that kills them. It just has that inherent property, and it gets translated to the plastic.
I'm curious about the exact same question.
Okay.
How do you know it wasn't like the vinegar that just killed bacteria?
Yeah.
Because other people have also done the same, because if you do just the powder, like just the, not the plastic, just the crushed up prawn shells, it exhibits the same traits. It's not, that's what I would think as well, like people would ask, acetic acid would kill bacteria, but it does, but also, so does this.
Just one question about that.
Then, did you try the same thing with that normal plastic? Like as a control?
Well, normal plastic has no antibacterial. It was
Yeah, but this is a control to make.
Yeah. Because you can, I've just added Google searches and whatnot, and it exhibits no antibacterial properties whatsoever, so just grow anything.
I believe we're going to help Sushan do some bacterial work in the lab.
Yeah, later, but I haven't training that to help with that. Okay, so there's another problem that I haven't touched on, I think, and that's plastic pollution, and that's, yeah, a bad thing. So much so that maybe you didn't know this, but half of the plastic we use, half the plastic that we use is used only once before it's thrown away. Whether it be into the landfill or it's incinerated or thrown into the ocean, wherever it may be, half of it's only used once and then it's thrown away. And that's really bad for something that doesn't decompose anywhere. This amounts to around 8 million tons of plastic every single year going into the ocean. It's literally an oil spill, but it's like a late stage oil spill because plastics need some water.
You heard of Plastic Island?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was I going to say? Okay, yeah. So you might be saying, why is it such a big deal? Because I'm sure you've heard of biodegradable plastics already, like one's made from cornstarch, one's made from bacteria, like why is this any special? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because biodegradable plastics in their current form are biodegradable in the way that we would think them to be. Like when we think of biodegradable, I don't know about you, but I do, and many other people I talk to, you would think it'd be biodegradable in the same place regular food would be biodegradable. That's not the case. A report done by the UN in 2015 called the Biodegradable Plastics and Marine Litter Report says material may be labeled biodegradable if it conforms to certain national or regional standards that apply to industrial composters and not domestic compost heaps or discarded litter in the ocean. What this means is biodegradable plastics in their current form behave just like regular plastics in the natural environment, which goes against the purpose. You would think then, why do they exist otherwise? There is no purpose for them, because they do the same job as regular plastic. Now they are not complete lies, because On the left is PLA, which is the cornstarch plastic, and on the right is PHA, which is made from bacteria. These are biodegradable, but they're only biodegradable under extreme heat and extreme humidities. The only time you'll ever find them is in industrial composters and never in the natural environment, unless you went into like an volcano or something. So that doesn't really help the problem. Not only that, it actually costs money to sort them out from regular plastics. So if you want to compost these, you need to separate them from regular plastics, which costs a lot of money. And the entire thing is literally a scam. Like, there's no point of them. Like, you say 100% degradable and it's biodegradable and whatnot, but it means nothing because if you throw it into the ocean, it'll be as if it was plastic made from oil. It would have no discernible effect. Whereas this plastic, I've tested it, you put it in the soil, you put it into water, you put it on your compost heap in your backyard, it'll decompose, it'll break down, it'll be eaten by bacteria, it'll be eaten by just things in general. After it loses its properties, after however long it took. Plastic I buried in soil took around a week on average, but I discovered if you add things like PVA, where it has no real effect on the physical properties or the chemical properties, you're able to actually fine-tune how long it takes to decompose. So if you wanted to decompose after a month, you would put the amount of PVA required to make it last a month, and so on. When talking about cost, I think you'll be like asking how much does it cost? Is it even really, the word is justifiable to make it a thing? Prawn shells are a waste product. They're either incinerated or thrown into landfill because there is no use for them. If you go to a seafood retailer, they'd rather pay you to take their waste for them because there's no use for them. But if you were to buy them on Alibaba, yep.
I was just wondering, like, if you're very serious about replacing the biodegradable industry, however, this is going to massively change, and if we're looking at comparative volumes, how much are prawn shells going to be suddenly in demand if your plastic then replaces current biodegradable plastic?
Yep.
Prices are amazing. However, how do the volumes compare?
I'm not sure.
As in, how does the volume? If we would demand as much prawn shells as we are demanding cornstarch for our plastics, do you think that we would be able to meet that demand, or would we have to go fish additional prawns to be able to go to those?
In the US, last year they fished 3 million pounds of prawns.
Yeah, that's what I want. Yeah, nice.
Locally, that'd be a lot more, especially in places like East Asia where they eat a lot more seafood than other parts of the world. There's no shortage of prawns.
Yes.
We don't need to fish more prawns right now. Maybe in a century's time where this is the 100% plastic, that might be the case, and we have prawn farms specifically for the use of plastics and nothing else. But right now, there's no use for them. It's just thrown away because there's no use for them. And there's no, in the foreseeable future, there's no reason why the price would go up. Obviously, demand will increase, and if other companies are doing the same thing, it's going to get a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
But it won't be as much as cornstarch because the corn that's farmed for cornstarch is specifically for cornstarch. It's not a waste product. You're farming that for the sole purpose of making plastic, whereas this is just a byproduct of another industry. You go to Burton's polyethylene making the petrochemical industry is $1,400 a ton, and PHA is just completely out of the conversation because it's a obscure method of using bacteria and it costs around $4,500 a ton to make PHA.
This is obviously raw material costs,
Yeah.
but if you were to factor in the actual production costs
Yeah.
Per tonne of making an equivalent amount using prawn versus corn, for example, that would be an interesting statistic to do a comparison on. And again, I suppose echo that was exactly my thoughts too around the volume as well. What is that capacity and etc. So I mean, they're obviously the economics that you probably want to think about.
I'd say, let's say worst case scenario, the production process, it's not, it's a really simple process. Like the process I'm using right now on small scale is literally using just an oven. But at large scale, what we'd use is the same process they use to make photographic film that's used by Kodak and whatnot. It's basically by extrusion and oven. It's an oven either way. It's either that way is automated, this way I'm doing it myself. But they use gelatin, they extrude it on a conveyor belt, it heats, makes photographic film. It's a really simple and inexpensive process to make it at scale.
And others have already been doing similar to what you're doing here.
Yep.
So they haven't thought of this idea about this angle in terms of replacing plastics.
I'm sure like it's definitely a lot of research papers on this plastic,
Mm.
but there's research papers going back to like 1975. There's never been an attempt to commercialize it. I don't know why that is. When I was starting working on this like 8 months ago, I'm like, there has to be a reason why. Like, it's something I'm overseeing because I'm tunnel visioned on. This is amazing. There's something people are overseeing, and I became more and more cynical by the day. But there's something I'm missing out on that I'm not taking into account because I don't know it exists and whatnot. But there is nothing. There is no reason why they haven't. It's just a coincidence. Like, I mean, there has to be someone who does it first, but no one ever did. You go to research papers from like 1980. This is one paper from some Indian, because they have a huge like shrimp farming industry over there, and they're like, what if we can use this waste instead of throwing it away and incinerating it? And they're like, well, this plastic is actually amazing. It has such good properties. This will be good in the future in the food packaging industry, but nothing came of it. And I don't know why. People have done work from them. Yep.
Going back a couple of steps to the biodegradable aspect,
Yep.
instead of decaying in a week or so, you could extend it by adding PVA.
Yep.
But just thinking of an industrial situation where you've got giant factories using tons of plastic and storing it for months or years at a time, is there any risk that this can't withstand those circumstances? Maybe a lot of weight on them, would it compress them?
For those kind of applications, you wouldn't use this plastic. You would use polyethylene or petrochemically, because biodegradability isn't really a concern. If they're using it again and again or for a long period of time, they don't really care about that. Not only that, they'll get rid of it properly. This is more for packaging, for consumer products, as well as things like water bottles and whatnot in the future. Something that's used very quickly. The lifespan of the packaging when it's in the consumer's hand, like you and I, is very short. Whereas for industrial purposes, they'd be using that.
But I'm talking about consumer products. It's just that in the hands of the consumer may be short,
Yeah.
but the lead time,
Okay.
the manufacturing may take time. They need to get plastic,
Yeah.
form it, hold it in shipping, ship it,
Yeah.
hold it in storage, warehouse, and so forth.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be used for anything that isn't food. Yeah, because food, like fresh fruit and vegetables, it's very short. It's within a week. It's packed. It's like within days. If you buy an apple now, it's unless it's been frozen and whatnot. But it's packaged within. Sorry, I didn't phrase that properly. Like the apple you buy, I don't know if you've heard, but like sometimes they freeze apples for like months in like cryogenic facilities of just fruits, and then they thaw them out and they sell it to you as fresh when it's not really that fresh. It's still only packaged days before it's sold. And if we were to, so that's not a concern. And not only that, the majority of this, what this would be used for is before it even gets to the customer. So in the supply chain, so during post-harvest storage and processing and transport between the warehouse and the retailer and whatnot, during then, that's where the majority of this would be used because it's antibacterial properties. The biodegradability is more something consumers would care about and not the Woolworths and Coles. They don't really care about that. Yep.
Like, how extensive is the sterilization? Could it be used for any medical purposes?
Yeah.
That you know of?
Well, I don't know specific uses, but because it kills bacteria like both gram-positive and gram-negative, it definitely could be used for medical applications. I haven't looked specifically into what kinds, but this is a starting point. Because I know
Basic needle sterilization,
Exactly.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Amazing.
for like medical instruments and whatnot, packaging for that, if you were able to incorporate regular polyethylene, because biodegradability is not a concern there, you could put that in and it's extremely sterile, something like that. So because when I started this, the fact that it decomposes naturally, that was my biggest concern. I'm like, that's pretty cool. But as I did more work on it, it's the fact that it can kill fungus and bacteria like instantly. That's the biggest application for it, in my opinion. And so if it was mixed with something that didn't decompose, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. If it still carried those antibacterial properties. Yep.
Quick question. If for whatever reason it was like, if the plastic was put into a freezer or whatever, would that damage its properties? Like, can you just take it out of the freezer and, like, say if it was packaging something, would it still work? Or, like, would it become, like, really brittle and just fall apart?
Yeah, so I've tried that. Like, I wanted to see how refrigeration affected fruit spoilage and whatnot. The plastic is as is. If you heat it, that's a different story. If you put it at, say, 100 degrees, if you put it in the oven or something, it becomes insanely brittle. But if you cool it down, it has no real effects on the actual plastic itself. Just heating it is an issue. But only if you go like really high. I've left it overnight for like 3 days at 50 that's cost. Okay, so just to recap, it's made from the shells of shrimp, of prawns and crabs and lobsters, which is the waste product. It radically decreases the rate of ripening by almost well, up to 50%. It's inherently antifungal and antibacterial, and it's truly biodegradable. Not biodegradable in the sense that they market it, or rather, they're using it as a marketing ploy. It's actually biodegradable. But wherever you throw fruit and vegetables, and that decomposes, wherever organic material decomposes, so will this. So in its current form, it'll only be used by solving the problem of spoilage, microbial and ripening. But in the future, maybe for certain applications like bottles and whatnot, it'll have a bigger impact on pollution because it'll be able to decompose, whereas it doesn't. Regular plastic does not decompose now. Yep.
Super big thank you to you, man. I try and get all the interns to come and terrify them by getting to speak to everyone, but you've done really well. Are there any additional questions for Sean?
Someone already have a patent for it?
No.
Really?
Yeah. Because it's literally just the plastic I gave you is 97% water content. They can't patent something that's naturally occurring and it's just dissolved in water.
Even the process.
Yeah, process is a different story, but there is no production process because no one's tried to commercialize it.
You could try for an innovation patent, which would give you a short period of time, only Australia-wide, but it's pretty cheap.
Yeah, do it. I'm just going to ask the PhD chemist to come and interrogate the first year chemist.
You mentioned it at high temperature it degrades and stuff like that. Have you tried to heat seal it?
Sorry?
Heat seal it. That's probably like if I was a packaged guy, I think that'd be the first thing I'd ask whether you can heat seal it.
Okay.
Meaning fruit plates.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's 2 months in.
So you're making it out of like prawn bits and lobster bits, right?
Yeah.
Where are you going to get that stuff? I mean, is it a waste material or something?
Yeah. So
Does someone have a whole pile of it sitting around?
they throw it they either incinerate it or they throw it into the dumpster and it's carried away because there's no use for it.
Once you make the market for it, people will start.
Yeah, definitely. But right now, if you're the first person, you can hoard a shit ton of and just use it and really
Come see my giant pile of secret. Doesn't smell anything.
I really enjoyed the talk. It's fascinating. So you say that just crushing up the shells can be also antimicrobial properties. I knew a guy who grew apples and would spray clay onto his apples to keep the bugs off of them as an organic, natural way of deterring the bugs. Have you ever thought about creating something even more simpler than having a plastic film for deterring the ripening of fruits and vegetables, and just kind of creating a simple spray that the growers can spray on there rather than having to worry about making a plastic? You're kind of cutting out production there. I mean, the plastics are awesome. I think continuing on with that obviously is really interesting, but have you ever thought about doing that?
Yeah, definitely, because I know that's a thing that they spray with either wax or whatnot to maintain its properties. But the thing is, that doesn't solve, like, you can't transport in a truck just free apples. There'll always have to be something that holds those apples. Whether it be a crate that's laced with the corn shells crushed up or something. There'll always be a need for packaging. And while that's true, but that'll only be, if you're like a big company like Woolworths, you don't really care about that. If it was like a small farm or something, then maybe an option. And that'll be marketing itself. But if we were to aim at the Aldis, the Woolworths, the Doles, the Coles and whatnot, packaging would be where it's at.
This appears to be more cost effective. If you sell them the spray, it's way more cost effective for them.
Because then they have to do it individually. It's a different process in itself because it's labor intensive. Whereas packaging, they just cover it and that's it. They don't have to rely on a person spraying it to such an effect that it satisfies their needs of antibacterial and whatnot.
Would you license out your technology to someone that maybe wants to do a biotech startup doing the same thing?
I mean,
By the spray?
sure. It is like, in my opinion, I just don't see that as valuable. That's just my opinion. Maybe I'm probably wrong because
I don't know. I just assume that they spray lots of food all the time. That's why the apples look so shiny and
just quickly, we got, sorry to cut it off. Maybe I'll do 3 last questions, because we still have 1 more presentation to go, which is introduction to CRISPR. Who hasn't had a go? Right at the back.
Speaking of the semiconductor, it might of the clay and the plastic, you might want to think because your plastic control shells, you might want to look at the salt or the electrolyte content. I don't know your processes, but the question is, what's the probability of having an allergic reaction to the plastic if you made it?
That's obviously a big concern.
Or pseudo allergic reaction.
Something that there's an inherent property with prawn shells that's actually really interesting. It actually instantly stops blood flow. And during World War I, they used bandages which were coated in a solution which prawn shells were dissolved in. And they did a test, I think maybe a few years ago in America someplace. And they had people who were allergic to shellfish to test those bandages and see if they were allergic to prawn shells. And they're not. They're actually only allergic to the meat. And those people didn't have any discernible effects from the bandages.
Second last question, Brian.
Well, just 2 questions. Awesome presentation. Could you eat it? And if you stock enough to throw your groceries into it, like a grocery bag, could you do that? I'm imagining a world where you could carry your groceries home with that, and a bag made by it, and perhaps eat it.
I mean, like, I'll just show you this.
Yeah.
You're gonna eat it?
I'll try to break it. I'll just like pull it as hard as you can. And see if it's strong enough.
Yeah, it's wrong.
Fantastic.
Yes, it's strong. There's no argument about that. And you can eat it if you want. Like, you can break a piece off.
The taste test. Oh. Go for it. No, it's good.
So does it let the ethylene come in? So
Well, let it escape.
yeah.
So it's permeable.
yes.
My theory is, like, I don't know if it's true, but I have an electron microscope. That is not actually a polymer. It's just a matrix, and there's gaps in between where the gases are allowed to pass through. Whereas,
The reason I
It's
ask is because
semiconductor.
because in the supply chain, typically fruit and vegetables are picked very early, and they actually introduce ethylene to those vegetables or fruits in order to ripen. And so if you're packaging them very early in the process or even late in the process, you actually have to allow ethylene to come in, as well, I guess you said, as let it release. So does it actually let ethylene come in?
Yeah.
And it gets
so
close to
it's literally just an open window. So the gas can go in and out. It doesn't like stop it going in. It just allows it to escape. Instead of accumulating constantly, it allows it to breathe basically.
Right.
And yeah, that's just how it works.
the same would be on the shelf
Yeah,
inside of a store.
So just quickly, what do you need from now to take over the world with prawn shells? Money? How much money do you need?
Like, to get to the next stage, I probably gonna need like 100K. Like, honestly, just to develop the production process at scale, patent it, and then from there, I just need money to actually make the product, like on a large scale. But I can make like a prototype with like 5K, get that running proper, and it works great, and then all that requires making it bigger. Yes, sir. Basically.
There's a grant for that.
Yeah.
There's a grant for that.
Thank you, Sushant. So just quickly, Alex's dad, Michael Kelly, has showed us some pizzas. If you want to grab some at the end, and then in about 10 or 15 minutes, I'll call you all back in, and we'll have our introduction to CRISPR presentation.